Hello, listeners and fellow book lovers. Welcome to the Book Snug, a bi-weekly conversational podcast about books and the reading life. My name is Julia.
And I'm Stephany.
And we're a mother and daughter who love reading and talking about books. The ones we adore and the ones we don't. We're delighted you're here, so grab your favorite hot drink or ice-cold beverage and settle in for another cozy, bookish chat.
Hi, Julia.
Hi, Mom.
How are you this morning?
I'm good. Yeah.
Good. I'm good, too.
Good.
It's a kind of a rainy Saturday morning, and I'm feeling kind of like a rainy Saturday morning.
Oh, my gosh, yes.
So it's good to be here in the Book Snug with our candle and our tea, and we're going to talk about some fun things.
Yeah.
So what do you have in your mug today?
This is a white peach tea from Stash.
Oh, very springy.
Yeah.
Actually summery, but still.
Yeah. Yeah. Just something light and perky because it is. I'm feeling I want to go back to bed to feel like
the doldrums.
Yes. What are you drinking?
I'm drinking my standard tea, which is Earl Grey. It gives me a boost in the morning. I like the flavor. So I'm just being standard today.
Okay. Sounds good.
Well, today we are going to be talking about Cinderella and some of our favorite and most enjoyable Cinderella retellings. The reason we're choosing to talk about Cinderella now is because we feel like spring is the perfect time to read fairy tales and fairy tale retellings and fairy tale adjacent stories. We picked Cinderella because it's probably the most famous, most popular fairy tale, at least in the Western world, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree. So interesting. Cinderella is not my favorite fairy tale, but I have read more Cinderella stories than I have any other fairy tale.
It's not my favorite. It's probably my second favorite fairy tale. Beauty and the Beast is by far my first.
Oh, see, I like
favorite.
Sleeping Beauty first.
Okay. But I haven't read that many Cinderella retellings. I know there are a ton of romance novels that base their storyline on the Cinderella story, but I'm not a huge romance reader.
Yeah.
And I like Cinderella. I like the story arc of Cinderella, but it isn't my favorite.
Yeah.
But we chose it for this week's episode, and I think we're going to have a lot of fun talking about it.
I agree.
I thought before we jumped into our book recommendations that we could just talk a little bit about the fairy tale of Cinderella. It has a long history. The first recorded fairy tale is Egyptian.
Oh, cool.
It's an Egyptian-Greek kind of mashup. And the name of the Cinderella character in that story is Rhodopis, which means the rosy-cheeked. And the story is about a servant girl who is left behind when everybody else goes to a ball. And a bird comes and picks up her sandal and drops it in front of Pharaoh. And he is enamored with it and wants to find whose foot the slipper, the sandal belongs to. And he puts it on the feet of all the girls in his kingdom and finds Rhodopis, falls in love with her, and they live happily ever after.
Oh, I like that version.
Yes. I think it would be a cool story to take and turn into a novel or even a picture book. That tale comes from, I think, the 6th century BCE. So we're talking centuries before Christ.
Yeah.
And then there is a Chinese fairy tale from the 600s AD that has a similar theme. All of the Cinderella stories have a similar theme of this girl, usually kind-hearted and beautiful, in very dire circumstances. Something or someone intervenes for her, and she ends up having this wonderful ending to her story. She marries a prince, falls in love, has a happily ever after. The story of Cinderella can be found across time. It can also be found across the world, across cultures. I think there are over 500 versions of Cinderella just from Europe.
Which is so interesting.
I know, it's crazy. China has their own version of Cinderella. A lot of the Asian countries do, Korea, Japan. Very, very fascinating to me that this is such a widespread plot that everybody seems to get on board with.
Yeah. Well, and it makes me wonder about the history of fairy tales, because what would have inspired that in Egypt and then to show up in another country later on?
Yes.
Like, I would be so fascinated to dive into that.
Yeah. The Cinderella story that we are most familiar with comes from, now I'm going to say the English version of this Frenchman's name. We would say Charles Perrault. I think in French, you say his name Charles Perrault.
Sure.
He wrote a book, a collection of fairy tales in the very late 1600s. I think like 1690, 1695. Okay. I'm not going to say the French name of the collection, but it is the Mother Goose Tales.
Oh, okay.
And the original collection had 8 fairy tales, 4 of which we're very familiar with. Puss in Boots, Little Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, your favorite, and Cinderella. He calls Cinderella Cendrillon. And his version of the story is the one that we know the best. It's the one that Walt Disney used to do the animated film. He adds the pumpkin, he adds the fairy godmother, he adds the glass slippers, and those are new to the story. But that's the version that we are most familiar with.
And then there's also a version where the ball lasts for 3 days. And I didn't learn about that version until I was much, much older in life. Yeah. Because I grew up with the standard single ball, like leaves her shoe that night. But I know that that's the version that's used in Into the Woods, the musical, is the 3 nights. And then it pops up in some other places as well. But that was an interesting thing about the story that I didn't know like early on either. Yeah,
there's also a version, and this feels more like a true fairy tale to me, where the stepsisters actually cut their toes off to get their feet to fit the slipper. Of course, Disney would not put that in an animated movie, but yeah, there are darker versions of the fairy tale. And then after this gentleman, Charles Perrault, wrote his collection of fairy tales, then the Brothers Grimm did versions. And so here we are today. Yeah. And we won't be talking about the actual fairy tale. What we want to do is talk about books that do Cinderella, either in an interesting way, they write the story in an interesting way, or they take the story and riff on it, or do an adjacent storyline. So how do you feel about that, Julia?
I'm all for it.
Are you?
Yeah.
Before we dive into the books, do you have a favorite Cinderella movie that you like to watch?
I have 2, and I think they're so different that I can't pick between them. The first one I watch pretty regularly, and I can probably quote the movie top to bottom. And that is the Rodgers and Hammerstein's A Cinderella with Whitney Houston and Brandy.
Yes, that's a fun version of Cinderella.
Once I found out that was on Disney Plus, it's on repeat, like regularly. I walk around the house singing the songs, but I've been watching it since I was like 5 or 6. But then also I love Ever After with Drew Barrymore. And I think I love that story because Danielle, who is Cinderella in the movie, she's not waiting for things to change. She's going to take care of things herself. Yes. I think one of the best scenes in that entire movie is when she herself rescues herself from when she was sold off.
To the nasty man. Right. I can't think what his name is.
I don't think we ever really hear it. But as she's walking out of that and you see that she's free, that's when the prince shows up and he's like, "What? I was coming to save you. What happened?" Right.
There's a lot of agency.
Yes.
I like the social commentary in that movie. Yeah, very good. I enjoy that too.
Yes, that's if I've had a really bad couple of days, I put that on and just, it's my comfort movie.
I do. I like both of those movies. I actually forgot about the Rodgers and Hammerstein version. I have a very special place in my heart for the animated Disney version of Cinderella. I think it was maybe the first movie I ever saw as a little girl. So it made a big impression on me.
Yeah, sure.
I just loved everything about it. I loved the mice. I loved Cinderella. I loved the fairy godmother and the magic and the singing. All of it. Yeah. And I also really enjoyed the live action version of that same movie done by Disney.
Yes,
with Lily James. I just thought she was the perfect visual
Yes.
creation of Cinderella.
Yes. And that has Helena Bonham Carter as the fairy godmother too, right?
Yes. Yeah. Lots of humor there.
Yes.
Very funny. I also think the chemistry between Cinderella and the prince, who is Richard Madden, was really good. Really sweet. Very just wonderful.
Yeah. Not overly done or saccharine or anything.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed that movie as well.
Yeah, I'm actually going to talk about it in one of my books.
Oh, sorry. Didn't mean to jump the gun there.
I think it works. I think it'll give some more context what I'm talking about when I get there. So.
Well, why don't we dive into our books then? What's a Cinderella story that you want to talk about?
Yes. So actually, I will say the books that I'm going to talk about are going to move from childhood into young adult. So it's going to start with a picture book and then end with a YA.
Okay. So that's how you organize your books today.
Yes. The first one I'm talking about is Cinderella, obviously, but it's illustrated by K.Y. Kraft.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
This one, and then I think it's a Sleeping Beauty one is the other one. I grew up with. I remember reading these all of the time, looking at the pictures. It is the traditional story of the single night ball, not the 3-night ball, set in 1700 France. So the illustrations in this book are in a French cottage in the countryside, and then they move into the ball, which are then set in that fancy French...
Yeah, extravagant, luxurious.
Big hoop skirts.
Big white wigs.
Yeah. Looking at these images, which are delicate and decadent and detailed and sumptuous even, but very sweet. Like they just feel soft and sweet. Reminds me a lot now as I'm older looking through it of the Lily James Cinderella.
Okay.
Of the this is how a fairy tale should be kind of feeling. Growing up, I remember just staring into these pages, feeling like I couldn't look at all of the details ever. There is an image of the fairy godmother. Now, she is not in traditional dress. However, she looks like she's a blue butterfly.
Yeah.
And I just remember thinking that's magic. That's magic right there. It's beautiful images. And the story is sweet, but for me, this book is about the pictures and less about the story.
Right.
Because it's a picture book. So
well, and the illustrations tell the story.
Yes.
You wouldn't even really need words. You could probably figure it out without a single word being on the page.
Yes. So that is my introduction of my Cinderella books.
And that is a true Cinderella story. That's not a retelling. That's not a riff on the story. No. It is Cinderella.
Yes. Yes. These are books that I have saved so that my kids can see them. And even if not my kids, I think it's C.S. Lewis says, you're never too old for a fairy tale.
Yes.
So I will definitely always have this book on my bookshelf, regardless if I am 26, however old I am, or 45 or 98. Like I will always have this book on my shelf.
Yes, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to bring a picture book as my first book as well. And in our introduction, I said that the Cinderella story is evident across cultures. And I am bringing a Native American version of Cinderella today called The Rough-Faced Girl. This is an Algonquin tribe retelling. The Algonquin Indians were a northern Atlantic coast Indian group. They inhabited upper New York, the Hudson River Valley, Lake Ontario. And this book actually starts out saying that there was a small village on the shores of Lake Ontario. This is an illustrated children's book. It's written by Rafe Martin and illustrated by David Shannon. And I'm with you, Julia. The illustrations in this book are just glorious. I think they're done with pastel, so they have that really glowy
very
feel.
Rich.
Yes.
Yeah.
I could be wrong, but that's what it looks like to me.
It could even be oil paint, too.
It could. You're right. It could. Oils or pastels. And it follows this young girl who is the youngest daughter of 3. Her older sisters are, of course, selfish, self-centered. They're arrogant and vain, and they treat their youngest sister very poorly. She ends up having to tend the fire in their teepee all the time, so she gets burned from the embers. And that's how she gets the name Rough Face Girl. But she is very kind-hearted, and she spends a lot of time in nature. She is the Cinderella of this story. The prince is the great invisible being. And all of the young women in this village want to marry him, but you cannot marry him unless you can see him and describe what he looks like. The only person that has ever seen him is the rough-faced girl, because he is everywhere in nature. The invisible being has a sister who kind of is like the gatekeeper to him. She asks all the questions. She determines if anyone is worthy to even make an attempt to see him. Her older Cinderella, she never really has a name. She's just called the rough-faced girl. Her older sisters decide they're going to go, and one of them is going to marry the invisible being. And of course, they have never seen him, so it all comes to naught. And the rough-faced girl just decides one day that she's going to go and present herself for marriage. And of course it works out, and they get married. This is a plot point by plot point retelling of the Cinderella story. But it's beautiful. It's beautiful to read out loud. The images, like your book, Julia, are just lovely. You wouldn't need any words. You could tell the whole story just from the pictures. It would be a great book to share with kids, but I like it. Yeah. I think it's beautiful. I recognize the artistic talent in the illustrations and also in the writing. So The Rough-Faced Girl, Rafe Martin, and illustrated by David Shannon.
I remember that book from my elementary school days and then had totally forgotten about it until I saw it on the counter, whenever you bought it, maybe in the past few months.
Yeah.
And so it brought back this wave of memories of reading it and how... it's a sad story. Cinderella innately is kind of a sad story at the beginning.
Very, yeah.
And I just remember the first time that I was reading this as a child, just feeling so heartbroken for this poor girl who was getting this awful, awful life. And I didn't remember the end of the book as much as I remembered the front of just how sad I felt for her. But definitely a good one for Cinderella collections.
Yes, I agree. What's your next book, Julia? Are we moving up in age now?
We are, yes.
Okay.
My next book is Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine.
Oh, I love this. I love this book.
Now, I need to say, this book and the movie are two very separate beings. You can't... There's
no comparison.
No. We will talk about books to movies at a later date.
Well, we can talk about this now.
Sure. Sure. The book, the premise of the book and the movie are the same, of being given this quote unquote gift of obedience, and how that impacts Ella Afrell as she is growing up with an evil stepmother and vain stepsisters, and what that means for her life and trying to beat that.
Right. And that's the base plot point for both the book and the movie.
Yes. The movie takes on a bit of a more romantic rom-com adventure story.
Campy. It's very campy.
Yes, very fun. So much fun. But the book is not as much like that. It's much more of Ella's independent pursuit.
Yes.
Versus doing it with Prince Char.
Yes.
Like in the movie.
You and I saw the movie first.
Yes.
And loved it.
Yeah.
I think Mark loved it too.
Yeah.
I don't remember Aaron so much watching it with us.
I was in elementary school, so...
But we all really thought it was fun. It has the feel of A Knight's Tale.
Which I've never seen.
Okay. So you have this old-timey, like olden times feel, but there's current music and everybody is dressing kind of olden times.
But kind of modern.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you approach the movie that way, it's a good time.
Yeah.
And I hadn't read the book. I don't know if you had yet. So I had no like preconceived notions of what the movie
frame of reference
would be like. Then I read the book, loved it, and understood why people were so up in arms about the movie. I didn't have any of that. I like them both for different reasons. I really love the book though.
Yes. Yes.
So go ahead, talk about the book.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in on your... I jumped right in.
Well, it's been a while since I've read the book. Yeah. But I do remember there being differences. And I think we actually listened to the book first before I actually read it.
We might have listened to it together. Yeah.
And that's probably why it feels so fuzzy to me, because listening to a book, I kind of get that way. Like, I know the story, but I couldn't tell you the plot points. But I do remember that Ella was very, very independent and was aware of her gift and was just going to kind of do what she had to with it, but was not going to let that be her life.
And then something happens and she's forced to confront it and do something about it.
Yes. I don't remember if it's the same. I think it's the same thing as in the movie.
I don't know. But
I don't remember either.
Share all of the
I
details.
don't either.
Yeah.
Highly enjoyable middle grade story. One thing that I will say, this is going to sound funny, but I am going to tie it back. I have really tiny feet. And in the book, they talk about, there's fairies, there's fairy lines and fairy history in Ella Enchanted. And they talk about the fact that, if somebody has fairy blood if their feet are really tiny. And so the joke growing up was that I had fairy feet.
Right.
Because I have some of the smallest feet in the entire world. So I have always associated Ella Enchanted, the book specifically, with that.
Yeah.
Instead of the movie. Yeah.
I just remember Ella Enchanted having some very interesting things. Like, Ella had a skill where she was able to talk like the people around her. And I just remember specifically, was it trolls? Trolls had the gift of like speaking people into doing stuff.
Oh, ogres, I think.
Ogres.
Yes.
Okay, ogres. Yes. And Ella picked that up and turned it back on the ogres and got them to do what she wanted to do. So she had a lot of really interesting talents. And you're right, she was very independent. She had a lot of autonomy and agency is the word I use. She worked herself to get free of the curse.
Yes. And I think that that's kind of the same with a lot of Gail Carson Levine's fairy tale characters, specifically the female leads, and that they are independent beings. They might, want to pursue whatever romance is in front of them or whatever, but they are very much their own woman in what they're doing in their own life.
Yeah. I would say Ella Enchanted, it is not a true Cinderella retelling. It doesn't follow all the plot points.
Yeah.
It has a beginning that is very similar. A father remarries, brings nasty women back into the house. They treat her horribly. But then it turns into a quest story. And it does come back around because there is a prince, there is a relationship there, but it's not the full romantic, meet my prince, get married, have happily ever after.
Right.
So definitely adjacent to Cinderella, but not exactly following the storyline. But great writing. And it's an award winner, is it not?
Yeah, Newbery.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I second that choice. I love Ella Enchanted. I'm probably due for a reread for that, just for the pleasure of experiencing the story again.
If I have space in my spring list, I'll throw it in there, but I'm throwing everything in there at this point, so we'll see.
The way that I structured my books for today is I am moving from the closest retelling to the original Cinderella story. And with each book, we're moving a little bit further away from that story.
Okay.
So the second book I want to talk about is called Dance of Hearts. This is a novella that you can get on Kindle for $1.99. I think if you're a Kindle Unlimited member, you can get it for free. It's very short, very easy to read, just very enjoyable story. It's not perfect. I had a few issues with it, but it was a nice way to spend the afternoon. This does pretty much follow the Cinderella story. And the setting for this is Regency England. And we have a young girl. Her name is Melinda Winchwood. She is recently orphaned. And when I say orphaned, she's still 21 or something. It's not like she's a child.
Okay.
She was raised in a wealthy, genteel family, but when her father died, the estate was entailed to her next closest male relative, which is a cousin. They're city dwellers. He's married and has a wife and a daughter who's a little bit younger than her. They move out to the country to this estate, have no clue how to run it, are kind of foolish people. And so they keep her on as an unpaid housekeeper, manager of the property. They take complete advantage of her, but it makes sense in the time frame. In Regency England, women just really did not have many options. So she's stuck in this situation. She's the Cinderella character. The prince character is a recently minted duke. I think he never thought he was going to be the duke. He was like a second son, but everybody has passed away, and now he's going to be the duke. He is recently back from war, and he has a friend, and they are both visiting neighbors of the Winchwood estate. He is childhood friends of Melinda, and things go from there. I don't want to tell too much. I will say that the prince character, the duke, and his friend, they play a prank on everybody. They switch places. And because he's trying to prove to his friend that when you have money and you're an available bachelor, people do not leave you alone. They are constantly trying to get their daughters in your good graces so that you marry them. Okay. So there's this whole secondary plot going on. But the storyline definitely hits all of the major plot points of Cinderella. You have this young woman in very difficult circumstances. She's really struggling. And you have a character who comes in and gives them a little boost with magic. And then they go to a ball and then we go from there. The things I really liked about this story, I loved the Regency setting. It is a romance. And even though this is a novella, the author spends a lot of time developing the relationship between Melinda and the Duke. I can't recall what his name is. I think the Duke of Arundel. I think his last name is Arundel. So you get to spend a lot of time with them in their relationship. The fairy godmother aspect, supreme. And there's a little bit of a twist there. And then you do get your happily ever after. The only thing I will say is I felt like the ending was rushed. And there was one relationship in particular that didn't make a whole lot of sense at the end. But it's a novella. It was $1.99. So what can I say? It's a clean romance. It's very sweet, short. Like I said, read it in an afternoon and you get a little bit of boost of fairy tale goodness.
Fun.
Yeah, that's called Dance of Hearts by Byrd Nash.
Okay. I wonder, well, probably this is a dumb question, but like at Barnes & Noble, because I'd be curious to see like actually, so it's different on the Kindle versus like seeing it in
I'm not
person.
even sure you can get it in print.
Okay.
I think it's one of those books that's only available through Kindle.
Okay.
But if you have a smartphone, you can download the Kindle app read it right from there.
That's true too.
Yeah. What's your next book?
So I am going to have to give a disclaimer for this one. I have not read this book in quite a long time, but as we were talking about this script, we knew that we needed to include it. And that is I, Coriander by Sally Gardner.
Yes, and I read this. I think I read this with you right after you. Right after you.
Yeah. So it's been at least 10, 12 years.
Yes.
I'm just going to start with the Goodreads summary. I think that that's the easiest at this point. So in this exceptionally well-crafted tale, Coriander tells the story of her childhood in 17th century London and of her discovery that she has inherited magical powers from her mother, who was a fairy princess. But her mother's sudden death brings on a dark time for Coriander, and after mourning her beloved mother and dealing with the disappearance of her father and the wrath of her evil stepmother, Coriander finds herself locked in a chest with no hope of escape and no will to survive. But when a bright light beckons to her, it is then that Coriander's journey truly begins. Beautifully written, this magical and luminous story is destined to become a children's classic.
Yeah. So this is a story that doesn't follow all the plot points of the Cinderella story. It starts with Cinderella. Basically, you have a young woman in dire circumstances with an evil stepmother. A nasty stepmother, at least.
Yes, they were saying a strict Puritan stepmother.
Right. Okay.
Not that Puritans are evil.
Right, but they use that. They use the bad aspects of Puritan.
Yes, the contrast and strictness. Yes.
To make her ugly. And then the story goes from there.
Yes.
There is a prince character. There is a love interest.
Yes.
but it does kind of veer off the path of Cinderella.
Yes. Now, I had forgotten about this, but as I was reading reviews to try to spark memories for me, I was reminded of the fact that there are silver slippers that are important to the story. And that is one of the last things that Coriander's mom was trying to give her before she passed. And of course, you don't find out some of that until later, why they're important until later. But that is a very clear Cinderella-esque tie into the story right there.
And that's actually, when I was doing some research for the background on Cinderella, the silver slippers is more traditional than the glass slippers.
Oh,
the glass slippers are new.
Okay.
And they actually, scholars think that the glass slippers are an accident. And they happened because of the translation from French to English.
Oh, interesting.
They think that Perrault was trying to describe fur-lined slippers, and in the translation to English, it became glass slippers.
Okay.
I'm not sure how that happened. I don't know French, but the silver slipper or the satin slipper is much more true to the original Cinderella stories.
Interesting. I did not know that. But I also know that Old English and Old French are tricky beasts. So, yeah, Coriander it's I think just at about 300 some pages, if I saw that correctly on Goodreads. It is middle grade as well. I would say it's probably a step above Ella Enchanted, simply because I remember there being just darker atmosphere.
Yes, more difficult scenes.
Yeah. But the cover is beautiful. And I remember reading it thinking, that was a really lovely... Well, I wouldn't have been able to articulate it at that time as, that was a lovely reading experience.
Yeah.
But I remember that it sucked me in and really captured me while I was reading it.
Yes, I feel the same way. And it is a happily ever after as well.
Yes.
So definitely fairy tale in that way. Not all fairy tales have a happily ever after. I know that, but the Cinderella fairy tale does.
Yes. If the little bit that I talked about this book is interesting, please read it.
Yeah, it is. It's very good. It's another one, Julia, that you're bringing back to my memory that I feel like I should pick up.
Yeah.
And breeze through again, because it is really easy reading. They're not adult books, so you can really
tackle them in an
through
afternoon.
Them.
Yeah, it is definitely on my Amazon. I need to buy for my collection list. So, what is your next one, Mom?
My next book also follows the storyline of Cinderella pretty well, but it does it in a historical setting. The book is called Phoenix and Ashes by Mercedes Lackey. Mercedes Lackey is a very prolific, pretty famous fantasy writer. I think the height of her writing was in the 80s and 90s, 1980s, 1990s. This book is book 4 in the Elemental Masters series. And before everybody gets all up in arms and think we're heathens here at the Book Snug Podcast, the Elemental Masters series it's a series of books that are companion novels. They're not, you don't have to read them in a linear fashion. You can pick a book up anywhere in the series, read it, have a complete story, know exactly what's going on, and not feel like you're missing anything.
So like some of your murder mystery series that you're reading where you can just jump right in and it's totally
for
fine.
the most part. And there in these books, there's a very, very small through plot. There's one character in particular I'm seeing mentioned in a couple of the books, but you don't need to know that to enjoy this book. So let it go and feel comfortable picking up book 4 in a series before you pick up book 1, 2, and 3.
Okay.
This is the story of Cinderella based very realistically in a World War II setting in a small town called Broome outside of London in England. So with this setting, you're dealing with scarcity, you're dealing with the rationing that happened during World War I, and you're really dealing with the grief and loss that these people were feeling at that time. Really, there was not a family that wasn't dealing with the loss of a loved one. So there is a heavy melancholy aspect to this. The young woman who is the Cinderella character, her name is Eleanor. She is the daughter of a wealthy factory owner. He owns many factories throughout England. And of course, with the war, his factories are doing very well. He is called into service and killed. And she is left with her stepmother and 2 stepsisters. This version of Cinderella is heavy with magic. And it's a hard magic. The magic has an explanation as to how it's used. It has consequences when you use it. There are boundaries. So it's a very hard magic based in the elements. So earth, water, air, and fire.
Okay.
And her stepmother is an elemental master of earth, and she's a dark master. So she is pretty evil.
Okay.
And she binds Eleanor to the house and grounds.
Oh, geez.
She has spells. She does some dark magic. And Eleanor can't leave the house. She can't.
Okay.
Plus, she can command her to do whatever she wants her to do. So she is basically a slave.
Yeah.
The stepdaughters, the stepsisters, are also magicians, but they're not masters. They do have skill, but not a lot. And then the other thing that the stepmother has done is she's kind of put a spell on Eleanor so that other people don't really see her or recognize her. So she can't even get help from other people. So that's her situation. And she's in that situation for a long time. She's very intelligent. Before the war started, she was going to Oxford as one of the first women.
Oh, wow.
Even though she couldn't get a degree, she was still going to go to school. The prince version, the prince character in this novel is an RAF pilot. His name is Reggie, and he is the son. Well, he isn't the son anymore. He's actually, I think, the Duke. He's the landed gentry of this area.
Sure.
He's an RAF pilot. He's shot down and rescued. He's an elemental master of the air. And they take him to the trenches. The trenches are bombed and he's covered with dirt and he's tortured by some of the bad parts of the earth magic.
Sure.
When he comes home, of course, he is dealing with what they call shell shock, which is really PTSD. And he has bad injuries. Okay, so this is how this is all getting set up. Eleanor and Reggie know each other. They've known each other for a long time. He's actually the person that really encouraged her to pursue a degree at Oxford to go to school. So this is how the story starts. Like I said, it follows all the plot points. It just puts little twists on them. There's a fairy godmother in this that I loved. And Eleanor finds out that she also has some power.
Okay.
And she is another Cinderella who pretty much makes her own way. So she figures out what she needs to do to break free. She's dealing with a horrendously evil. I mean, we're talking evil. If you like your stepmother to be evil, this one is a good one. And then the other thing I will say about this book is the happily ever after is completely different than the normal Cinderella, but it is perfect for this story. Okay. So I highly recommend it. Just go in knowing that is not going to be a happy, fun read. I mean, you're dealing with real history that was tough and difficult. The prince character, Reggie, he is really struggling with PTSD, but Eleanor is the person for him. She really can help him. So that's my next recommendation. It sounds kind of
sad,
a downer, but you get a happily ever after.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep, things turn out very well.
I don't like dark magic in my fairy tales. I mean, that's where they should be.
Yeah, the stepmother she is evil with a capital E. I like that. I like the evil to be bad because I want the good to overcome it.
Well, no, right. I agree. But also, I want my fairy tales like I want my Lily James Cinderella of just kind of happy, no cares in the world, suspend reality. And
you're not going to get that with this.
Clearly not.
This definitely has some gravitas to it. So go in knowing that. Do you have anything lighter for us, Julia, since I brought the feel down a little bit?
Not evil, but I'm not going peppy and perky.
Okay. What's your next book?
The next one, so this is an older middle grade. We're still climbing right up the ladder here. And this is Just Ella by Margaret Peterson Haddix.
Okay.
This is another Cinderella that I reread all the time. And again, which is so odd because it's not my favorite fairy tale, but clearly
it's a good story.
Yeah. This story takes place after the ball. So you catch up with Ella when she is in the palace, learning her princess lessons, becoming accustomed to being a princess, and in the process of planning the wedding to the prince. She is bombarded with classes on history and etiquette and routine. She has a mentor who is probably just doing her job, but irritated the heck out of me because of how ungracious, is that the word I want? Or compassionate or ununderstanding.
Right.
It was, you do this or these are the very negative consequences. And Ella, you kind of come to find out that she put in a lot of work to get herself to the ball to escape her life. And she's finding, I'm not giving this away when I say, but she's finding that this life that she has in the castle right now is not what she was looking for. And so then tensions begin to arise as she's feeling frustrated with that. Mm-hmm. She discovers that the prince is actually 100% boring, top to bottom, that she does not get along with him in any way. She has a history teacher who is about her age, is a guy, but they become really good friends. And she has a couple other friends along the way, but she has to make some decisions about the life that she's willing to fight for. She is thrown in the dungeon at one point, and then...
Oh my goodness. Are you telling us the whole story?
No.
Okay.
No, but as you're thinking about what it means to start asking questions about, oh, I'm not sure this is what I want anymore.
And what does that mean?
Right.
Yeah.
I think the reason I liked the story, and it goes back to, I think, some of the movies I mentioned and some of the other books I've talked about so far, is that Ella is very much her own person. There's one scene where they have to go see a tournament because she's going to give out the reward because that was a princess duty. But they get to this tournament and they pull up a curtain so you can't even see the tournament, and they're just supposed to be there and be pretty without being seen. And Ella gets really annoyed and going on about, can't we make our own decisions? I'm a princess. I want to see this. Let me see it. And I think that that's the turning point of her recognizing that she has the ability to change her life and whatever that means or looks like. Mm-hmm. And I think another reason that I like this so much is that it's an untraditional ending for a fairy tale, because it's a happy ending, but it is not, no relationship is resolved.
Okay.
So it ends in a way you're like, oh, this is how it could go, but it's not definitively going in that direction.
You can make that up in your mind how you would want it to go. Mm-hmm. So it starts with the ending of Cinderella, and then creates a whole different story for her than just marrying the prince and living happily ever after. So a very creative way at looking at the ending.
Yes. I will say, I haven't read very many other of Margaret Peterson Haddix's other books. Her tone is very serious.
Okay.
And her Ella character is not... She's not Ella of Frel. She's not Cinderella. She's not sweet and whatever. And I think it took me a while as I was reading it growing up to realize that the edge that I was reading on Ella was not anything other than frustration, if that makes sense. So right. I would oftentimes get really annoyed with how Ella was portraying things or portraying people or perceiving situations, but it was the frustration that I was seeing.
And she was being a real person.
Yeah.
Okay. I never read that book. I might have to pick it up just to experience it one time.
Yeah. All of the decisions in here make sense, but I think if you would look at them separate, you'd be like, what in the heck is going on here? But they make sense with the trajectory of where things are going.
The next book I want to talk about is kind of along the same lines as yours, where the author has taken part of Cinderella's story and changed its trajectory or the direction it's going. This is another book by Mercedes Lackey, and it is called The Fairy Godmother. And it is the first book in her series, The 500 Kingdoms. And I have a feeling with this series, you have to start with the first book. Okay. So it's good I'm talking about the first one. In this book, we have a young woman whose name is, I'm going to say Elena. It's spelled Elena. But if there was an H in front of it, you would say Helena. So I've just been saying Elena, but you could probably say Elena. Yeah. Elena. She is the perfect Cinderella character in the absolute Cinderella situation. Nasty stepmother and stepsisters. She is put upon to be the servant for everybody, clean the house, run the household. The stepmother and stepsisters have run up so much debt that they have to leave. And they leave Elena or Alina behind in a house with no food. The creditors come and take everything. She has nothing. So she decides she's going to sell herself as a servant at this, what they call is a mop fair, where everybody who wants a job goes and stands on the street and people come along and they hire you if they want you. And she goes to this fair and nobody will hire her because they are afraid of her stepmother coming back and then demanding that they give her over. She has 2 very nice neighbors, older neighbor ladies, and they take as much care of her as they can. But what they do is they are both witches. She doesn't know this. They call in the fairy godmother for the kingdom. And she comes and she offers her a job. And the job is to be her apprentice to learn how to become a fairy godmother and to replace her so she doesn't have to be the fairy godmother anymore. She's older. She wants to retire. So she gives her that option, or she says, I can just take the magic that is surrounding you, your Cinderella storyline. I can take that for myself, and then you can live an ordinary life, and you'll be free of this Cinderella trajectory that you don't understand is forcing you to have to live a certain way. And she decides that she's going to be the apprentice, and the story goes from there. There's something called the tradition, capital T. It's like this magical force that works in all of these 500 kingdoms that causes certain people to live a story, a fairy tale story, like Rapunzel, like Cinderella, like The Princess and the Pea, and some of the other nastier fairy tales. Well, all of the fairy tales. But the fairy godmothers can interrupt that and change direction or make the magic work in a different way. That's their job. So I have to give full disclosure here. I'm not finished reading this. I'm in the middle of it. It has a much lighter tone than Phoenix and Ashes. The fairy tale creatures are like real fairy tale creatures, unicorns and brownies and wizards. It just has a much lighter feel. And I really like the main character, the Cinderella character. And I think there's going to be some romance. There's none that has come in yet. And I'm about 40% in. But so far, we've just been tagging along with her, watching her become a fairy godmother, building her skills. The reason she's even eligible is because she has all this magic wrapped around her, because she's the Cinderella story in this kingdom. So it's just fun. I'm curious to see what direction it's going to go, but I trust Mercedes Lackey. She did a really good job with Phoenix and Ashes, so I don't think I'll be disappointed.
It sounds highly creative.
Yeah. I think if I was going to recommend a book to you, Julia, this would be the one I would recommend, not Phoenix and Ashes so much. I mean, I think you would like it, but it is definitely, this is a much later book to read.
Yeah.
And she brings in so many fairy tale references. Like it's like Easter egg after Easter egg of fairy tale references. So
I might need to put that on my list for next year.
That's The Fairy Godmother by Mercedes Lackey. Do you have another book?
I do. I'm going to end on probably my favorite book of the bunch.
Okay.
And I'm surprised it's taken me this long to talk about this series. But my fifth book is Cinder by Marissa Meyer, which is the first of the Lunar Chronicles. The Lunar Chronicles is 4 separate fairy tale stories combining into one big adventure. The 4 fairy tales are Cinderella, which is the first one. Then you have Little Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel, and then Snow White is the last one. In Cinder, Cinder is a cyborg set in futuristic New Beijing. And when I say futuristic, I mean like way in the future. And in New Beijing, I think it's down the way that Marissa Meyer has this structured is it's like 5 world leaders. So Beijing is like all of Asia, and then America is North and South America. So it's to the point where it's like major
land masses.
Yeah. And then major governing bodies within that. This book follows standard Cinderella structure in that Cinder, she might be a cyborg, but she's still treated awful with the stepmother and stepsister. She has a great relationship with one of her stepsisters, but then I will say that there is a plague that is going on, so then that has an effect with some of those family dynamics. Cinder is trying to get away from her family, and so she uses a ball that is being thrown to be a distraction. Her original plan is to use that as the distraction to get away. There is a pumpkin-like carriage component to this story. A prince, Prince Kai. There is, I don't remember a fairy godmother character, but I know that there are elements of science that probably could fill that spot. In all of this, there's also dynamics going on with a kingdom on the moon, the lunar kingdom, and some of that is coming into play as well. And suddenly Cinder finds herself kind of behind the scenes, but involved in very serious plot points with the Lunar Kingdom. Mm-hmm. For me, this was just a fun story. Yeah. I thought the world building was great across the whole series. Sure, different parts where the different stories take place could have gone into a little bit more depth about the history of things. But for me, it was the perfect, and I don't use superficial to be diminutive, mm-hmm. but superficial as in you're telling me the story. Mm-hmm. That kind of world building. Yes. The characters were fun, maybe not fully complex, but they were fun characters to hang out with. Mm-hmm. And it was a story that I just enjoyed being in top to bottom.
Yeah. It's a great speculative take on not just Cinderella, but several fairy tales. Uh-huh. And then creating a cohesive storyline with all of them. It's very, very fun. I never mm-hmm. read any more books beyond mm-hmm. Cinder. I should keep going, mm-hmm. but yeah, I think Cinderella was very creative, very imaginative mm-hmm. book to read. Yeah, for sure.
And I remember thinking specifically as I was reading the series, but the series, I don't think you get so much of it with Cinder, but if you look at the series as a whole, you see how intelligently the fairy tales are woven in and out around each other so that they're independent stories, but then also how they weave in with each other with the original traditional fairy tale mm-hmm. outline as well.
I know it's a beloved series. Mm-hmm. Many, many people love mm-hmm. the Lunar Chronicles.
Yes. And I've heard that Marissa Meyer is in talks to make it a digital TV show, like not a live action TV show, but like a animated
CGI.
Yeah.
CGI.
Yeah. Yes. Digital. Yes. Yes. So that's my final pick. What's yours,
Good
Mom?
Choices, Julia.
Yeah.
My last book is the book that is the least like Cinderella as far as plot points go, but has a definite Cinderella feeling. When you're reading the book, you feel like you're reading about a Cinderella.
Okay.
The book is called The Blue Castle. It is by L.M. Montgomery. And if you are familiar with Anne of Green mm-hmm. Gables, then you know who L.M. Montgomery is. This is a story about a 29-year-old woman whose name is Valancy. She lives with her extremely overbearing mother and aunt, who treat her pretty much like a second-class citizen. She waits on them hand and foot. I think they're a pretty wealthy, well-respected family in their town. I'm sure this is a Canadian setting because L.M. Montgomery was Canadian.
Sure.
And their whole family, not just her mother, aunt, and her, they often get together for meals. And they just treat Valancy like she has no opinions. She has no worth. I mean, she really is put upon. And she hasn't been feeling well, so she decides to go to the doctor to just see if he can give her any advice. And she finds out that she has a disease that is life-threatening, that she will eventually die from. This is not spoilery. This is in the very beginning of the book. This notice is the impetus for her to, she changes her whole life. She moves out of her house. She gets a job and works for people that her mother cannot stand. She makes friends with all of these unique, crazy characters. She meets a man. They decide to get married for particular reasons. And there's this just wonderful romance. And she ends up with her castle and her prince and a happily ever after. So I don't want to say anything more than that, but there is, like I said, there's this feeling of Cinderella, even though it doesn't hit the plot points of the Cinderella fairy tale. There's no fairy godmother. Again, we have a woman who is making things happen for herself. Nobody is coming and rescuing her. She is doing it. And she is satisfied and content with that. There are some surprises. There are some really nice surprises mixed in here. And it's just a lovely story. And like I said, if you're familiar with L.M. Montgomery and her writing, you know you are in for a treat. One of the things she does incredibly well is nature writing. And you just feel like you are in the place where Valency is. And as the seasons progress and they're described, it's just lovely. The whole experience of reading this book was just lovely. So I can't recommend this book enough, even though I'm telling you it's not truly a Cinderella story. It feels very Cinderella-like.
Sure.
I think this is another book that you would like.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
I recommended it to my mom when she was in a reading slump a couple of months ago, and she absolutely loved it.
It seems like a Nana story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's my last Cinderella book. I think we did a wide range of options here.
We definitely did.
I hope, listeners, that you came away with at least one book that you would like to try.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd be curious too, listeners, if you've read any of ours. Have you read Cinder? Do you like Cinder?
Yeah. Or do you have any Cinderella suggestions? I mean, we didn't even touch on the numerous romances that mimic Cinderella that are out there. If you have any recommendations as far as that go.
Yeah.
I'm always looking for a new fairy tale retelling to read.
And spring is for fairy tales, like we said at the beginning. So bring your recommendations on. Our next episode, we're going to continue our fairy tale conversation.
Yes.
And this time we will be looking at Beauty and the Beast.
Woo! That's my favorite fairy tale.
Yeah, I just want to put in a reminder here. If you like our show, if you like hearing us ramble and blab about books.
Yes, gush over books.
Yeah. Please rate us and review us wherever you find us, on Spotify, Apple, wherever.
Apple Podcasts, yeah.
And we thank you so much for spending part of your day with us today.
We'd love for you to continue today's conversation with us at the Book Snug _podcast on Instagram and at the Book Snug Podcast on Facebook. All of our episodes can be found wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as at our website, thebooksnugpodcast.budsprout.com, where show notes for every episode can be found. We'd love to hear from you. Email us at thebooksnugpodcast@gmail.com.
As C.S. Lewis, one of our favorite authors, so famously said, "You can never have a cup of tea large enough or a book long enough to suit me," and we wholeheartedly agree.